Every spinning shaft in every machine Dojin had ever studied rode on bearings, not on brute iron, not on luck, on bearings. And the commonest way a machine died was not fire, not fracture, not flood. It was a seized bearing, a shaft grinding itself still against its housing, while the rest of the machine shook apart around it. He had known this since boyhood, crouched beside his grandfather on the workshop floor, listening to the old man describe failure modes, the way another grandfather might describe weather. The finest precision in the whole craft, Dojin said, looking across the bench at Cho Yeong. And it's yours. She didn't answer immediately. She was already looking at the parts laid out before her, the way she always looked at things she was about to understand. He had explained the anatomy first, because the anatomy was everything. A bearing was not complicated in concept, races, rolling elements, cage, but concept and execution lived in different countries. The outer race and the inner race, two hardened rings, one fitted to the housing, one riding the shaft, the space between them populated by balls that rolled instead of slid, carrying the load around the circle rather than dragging it across a flat. The cage, a spacer that kept the balls from bunching together, distributing them evenly around the circumference so the load had nowhere to concentrate. Round everywhere, Dojin said, tracing the cross-section he had scratched into the slate. Not round in one place and close enough in another, round everywhere identically. Every ball the same size as every other ball, within a tolerance so fine it makes our current gauges look like rope. This is not a matter of close enough. He set the chalk down. This is roundness as a religion. Cho Yeong studied the sketch. She had a way of going still when something interested her. Not the stillness of confusion, but the stillness of a person who was already working through the problem internally and didn't want the outside world interrupting. Baek Tae-ho had understood immediately what the bearing steel required. He had spent 3 days at the furnace before he said a word about it, and when he came back with samples. A high-chrome steel, through-hardened, the carbon and chromium balanced to produce a surface that resisted deformation under the kind of concentrated point loading a rolling ball produced. Ordinary steel would pit, ordinary steel would brinell, leave small craters where each ball pressed, and once the craters were there, the bearing was already dying. The little parts that carry everything, Tae-ho said, turning one of the rough ground blanks in his fingers. The surface caught the lamplight in a way that ordinary iron did not, a depth to it, a density. They get the best steel I know how to make. He said it without ceremony, the way he said most things, but Dojin had noticed that Tae-ho's voice always dropped a fraction when he was genuinely satisfied with the heat, and it had dropped now. The raceway grinding was Cho Yeong's operation, and watching her work it was not entirely comfortable. Not because she was uncertain, the opposite. She was so certain, so absorbed, that the rest of the workshop seemed to recede around her. She sat at the grinding fixture with the race clamped and rotating, the abrasive wheel dressed to the correct radius, and she fed it by feel and by sound, and by the resistance she felt through the hand that steadied the work. A high spot the size of nothing, a hair's hair. She would bring the wheel in by a breath, listen to the change in tone, withdraw, check, bring it back, round, all the way round, no lies left in it anywhere. That was what the operation demanded, the elimination of every lie the metal told about its own shape. Every deviation from true round was a lie, and the raceway had to be emptied of them. A fraction of a hair's breadth was the target, not because Dojin had set that number arbitrarily, but because the geometry of rolling contact was unforgiving. A high spot that size, on a surface moving under load, would generate heat. Heat would generate wear. Wear would generate more heat. The machine would begin to die from the inside, quietly, before anyone knew to look. Cho Yeong ground until the surface told her it was done. Then she checked it, and ground again where it wasn't, and checked again. The lamp burned lower. She didn't notice. The balls were a separate problem. Tae-ho had cast and rough ground the blanks. The final grinding and sorting fell to the whole team. The target was a matched set, every ball in a given bearing within a 10,000th of the same diameter as every other, not close, matched. A bearing that received unmatched balls was a bearing that loaded unevenly, and a bearing that loaded unevenly was a bearing that failed at the most loaded element first, then cascaded. Seo-rin ran the sorting with her usual precision and her usual dissatisfaction with imprecision in others. She had a gauge block stack and a comparator and a patience for repetition that Do-jin had come to rely on entirely. A bearing gets a matched set, she said, setting aside a ball that had failed the tolerance, or it gets nothing. Pyo Eun-ha was working on the cage geometry at the adjacent bench, the spacing calculation, the number of balls, the cage pocket dimensions that would hold each ball free to rotate without pinching it. The cage was easy to underestimate. A cage that gripped the balls even slightly would drag on them, add friction, generate heat, defeat the whole purpose. The cage spaces them equal, Pyo said, without looking up from the calculation, so the load shares around, equality even in steel. She said it lightly, but she meant it precisely. The load sharing was not a philosophical nicety, it was the mechanism by which the bearing survived. Distribute the load across all the balls, and each ball carried a fraction, concentrated on 2 or 3, and those 2 or 3 failed, and the bearing failed, and the shaft seized, and the machine died. The assembly took place in the late afternoon, when the forge had cooled enough that the air in the workshop was merely warm, rather than stifling. Cho Yeong pressed the inner race onto its mandrel. Seo-rin brought the sorted balls in their tray. Pyo fitted the cage. The outer race went on last, pressed carefully, square, no cocking. The whole works gathered around the bench. Mokjae had stopped what he was doing without being asked. Even Tae-ho had drifted over, arms crossed, watching. Cho Yeong held the assembled bearing in both hands. It was small, smaller than it seemed like it should be, given everything that had gone into it. A ring of steel no wider than 3 fingers, the cage visible through the gap between the races, the balls nested in their pockets. Everything we know, she said, in one little ring. She looked at Do-jin, then she looked at the bearing. Spin it, I can't look. A pause. No, I can't not look. Spin it. Do-jin set the inner race on the mandrel pin and gave it a flick with 2 fingers. The bearing spun. It kept spinning. That was the thing. It kept spinning, and it made almost no sound, a whisper, less than a whisper, the faintest suggestion of motion, rather than any actual noise, and it did not slow the way a rough bearing slowed, with that characteristic drag and wobble that meant something was wrong inside. It ran true, it ran free. The outer race stayed still, and the inner race turned, and the balls rolled between them in their cage pockets, and the whole assembly did exactly what a bearing was supposed to do, which was to make rotation nearly effortless. Cho Yeong made a sound that was not quite a word. Seo-rin brought the inspection gauge and checked the runout, the deviation from true round in the running races, and checked the radial play, and checked the axial play, and went through the full inspection sequence without saying anything, which was its own kind of answer. It passed. Cho Yeong's voice cracked on the word. She grabbed the bearing back from the mandrel and held it up toward the lamp, and spun it again with her thumb, and watched it go. I made a true bearing. Mokjae had both fists at his sides. There's no sound. It'll spin forever. We did it. The workshop was briefly loud in a way it almost never was. Even Tae-ho uncrossed his arms. Do-jin let it run. He watched Cho Yeong's face while she watched the bearing spin, and he thought about the first time he had seen her, a girl from the market square, barefoot, dismissed by everyone who looked at her, with a sense for curve and ratio that she had never been taught and couldn't entirely explain. He had known then that she would end up here, or somewhere like here. He hadn't known it would be this. Every machine dies of a seized bearing, he said, when the noise had settled, and you just beat it, the finest thing in the works, and it's yours. Cho Yeong looked at the bearing still spinning in her palm. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been a moment ago, not subdued but settled, certain. The rat from the market square makes the truest part in the kingdom. She said it without bitterness and without performance. She said it as a fact, because it was one. The celebration lasted until Seo-rin spoke again, which was not very long. She had been standing at her comparator since the inspection, running the numbers, and her expression had shifted into the particular arrangement it took on when the numbers were telling her something she didn't like. "It's better than my numbers go," she said. The workshop went quiet. "We made it by her touch. I can't prove it, and I can't teach it." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Dojin understood the problem immediately. A bearing that existed was a milestone, a bearing they could make again, reliably, in quantity. That was a manufacturing process, and the manufacturing process required that every critical dimension be measurable, recordable, repeatable. If the raceway roundness was finer than their finest gauge could resolve, then what Cho Yeong had done was produce a miracle, not a method. Miracles were not scalable. Pyo Eun-ha set her pencil down and looked at the bearing, still spinning slowly in Cho Yeong's palm. "Then the question is how we measure finer than we can measure," she said. "Tomorrow we go down through the floor." They left the bearing spinning on its mandrel that night, pinned upright in a wooden stand Mokjae had knocked together from scrap. It was still turning when Dojin banked the forge and trimmed the lamps. The whisper of it was almost inaudible. He had to stop moving and hold his breath to hear it at all. He stood there for a moment, in the near dark, watching the faint shimmer of the cage through the gap between the races. To make 1,000, they would have to push the measure itself finer. They would have to descend below the floor of what their current instruments could resolve, build new gauges, calibrate new standards, establish a new bottom to the metrology chain. It was the same problem they had faced at every level of the bootstrap. You could not make a thing more precise than your ability to measure it, and your ability to measure it was bounded by the precision of the instruments you had made before. Each level of the chain enabled the next. There was no shortcut through. And then, past that, past the metrology problem, past the matched sets, and the raceway grinding, and the cage geometry, and the through-hardened steel, past all of it, the engine waited, the spinning heart that would burn and breathe and drive the whole apparatus forward. The shafts that would need to spin free, sustained by bearings exactly like this one, for hours and days and years without ceasing. The bearing turned in the dark. The veil outside the workshop shed its pale guttering light across the ridge. They would build a heart that burns.